In just 5 minutes, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Roberts tried to silence Pam Bondi, former Florida Attorney General and a prominent legal advisor to President Trump, with a $50,000 fine. No evidence, no hearing, no defense, just raw authority in a room built to uphold justice. But before we dive into this story, I want to hear from you. Comment down below. Where in the world are you watching from? Let's light up this comment section. And hey, if you love stories with high drama, power shifts, and the kind of moments that leave people speechless, you're in the right place. Tap that subscribe button right now. Hit the notification bell so you never miss when we drop the next chapter in these powerful, untold stories. Bondi, seasoned in high-profile legal battles, entered the federal courthouse on Constitution Avenue for what was supposed to be a routine procedural hearing. The skies over D.C. were gray, but inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was far darker, artificial, heavy, staged. Court staff avoided her eyes. Even the silence felt scripted. Chief Justice Roberts sat at the bench like a monarch, not a judge. With cold detachment, he declared a violation of the Federal Communications Act, Section 204, and imposed an immediate $50,000 fine without opening arguments, examining evidence, or even acknowledging Bondi's presence with so much as a glance. But Pam Bondi didn't back down. She stood calmly, her legal instincts sharper than ever. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I haven't even been allowed to present my defense." Her words were calm but piercing. Roberts, visibly irritated, snapped back. "Unnecessary. You violated the law. There's nothing to discuss." This wasn't a legal error, it was a calculated power play. The room wasn't a courtroom, it was a trap. But Bondi, with decades of legal warfare behind her, wasn't just defending herself. She was already gathering ammunition. She reached for the law itself. She began citing landmark First Amendment and due process cases, Citizens United v. FEC, Texas v. Johnson. Every name she spoke chipped away at the illusion of control Roberts thought he had. Bondi wasn't there for theater, she was there for justice, and the courtroom was just beginning to feel it. Pam Bondi stood alone at the defense table, a figure of legal calm in a courtroom descending into judicial chaos. After her searing constitutional references and pointed questions, a ripple of uncertainty spread across the room. She had laid bare glaring truth. This wasn't justice, it was domination cloaked in legal robes. The prosecutor, Michael Harper, fidgeted. The court stenographer hesitated mid-keystroke. The gallery, once passive, leaned forward, silently absorbing Bondi's assault on unchecked authority. Then, suddenly, Roberts spoke. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," he declared. Abruptly, without eye contact and without explanation. But everyone in the room knew exactly what had just happened. It wasn't a break, it was a retreat. Pam Bondi didn't sit, she didn't move. She stood poised, hands calmly folded, documents at the ready, knowing full well that Roberts had left to regroup, to recalibrate, to call in reinforcements. Because what she had just done wasn't just challenge a fine, it was an open indictment of the court's abuse of discretion. And that challenge had landed like a direct hit. When the chamber doors creaked open again, every neck turned. Roberts re-entered, but he was no longer alone. At his side was Judge Samuel Coleman, a towering figure in the federal judiciary known for his sharp legal mind and intolerance for judicial theatrics. A man whose presence in a procedural media law hearing was so irregular, it sent a visible jolt through the gallery. Roberts tried to explain. "I've asked Judge Coleman to observe and, if necessary, provide guidance on certain procedural issues that have arisen." His voice was restrained. Neutral, on the surface, but those who listened closely could hear it cracking under pressure. Pam Bondi understood immediately. Coleman was Roberts' Hail Mary, a last-ditch attempt to salvage legitimacy in a courtroom he no longer controlled. Coleman took his seat with composed authority. He didn't posture, he didn't speak for effect. He simply turned to Pam Bondi and said, with all the calm weight of the law behind him, "Miss Bondi, please restate the constitutional concerns you raised for the record." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a test. A line drawn in the sand. And Pam Bondi knew it. She nodded once and stepped forward, not with bravado, but with the presence of someone who had faced down political storms, congressional interrogations, and courtroom ambushes, and come out stronger. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her voice level and clear. I will begin with the violations of due process as defined by this court's own precedent. Her tone wasn't emotional. It was exact, measured, prepared, dangerous to anyone trying to game the law. She was no longer just a defendant. She had become a litigator for something far larger, the integrity of the system itself. The air in the room shifted again. The rules had changed. Roberts, once unchallenged, now sat still, silent, outflanked by the very standards he had sworn to uphold. And across from him stood Pam Bondi, unshaken, unyielding, and unwilling to let the Constitution be treated as theater. This was no longer a hearing. It was a reckoning. The courtroom settled into a tense stillness as court staffer David called the next name. Investigator Andrew Baxter, take the stand. From the back of the courtroom, a man in a pristine gray suit rose, his posture confident, his face unreadable. Baxter had been with the Federal Communications Commission for over 2 decades. His badge gleamed under the courtroom lights as if he had polished it for this moment. But Pam Bondi didn't see polish. She saw hubris. He moved with the kind of assurance only someone untouched by scrutiny could carry. He swore his oath and took the witness chair like a formality, expecting an easy ride. What he didn't expect was that the woman walking toward him had cross-examined cartel witnesses, corrupt officials, and corporate giants. Bondi's expression was calm, even polite. But the steel in her eyes said otherwise. "Mr. Baxter," she began smoothly, "you filed the complaint that resulted in the $50,000 fine against me, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." Confident, crisp, no hesitation. "Did you personally observe the alleged violation?" "I did." "Do you have any photographs or video documentation of the violation?" "No, ma'am. Wasn't necessary." The air shifted. "Did you write a formal incident report, include timestamps, witness statements, supporting material?" "No. I've been doing this long enough to know what I saw." Pam Bondi paused, one beat two then. "So this fine was issued entirely on your personal judgment, with no physical evidence, no corroborating witness, and no written report?" "That's correct," he said, this time with a hint of irritation. Bondi nodded. "Thank you for confirming that." Then she turned. Not to the judge, but to the gallery. Her voice, though still calm, took on a precision that cut like a scalpel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we now know that this $50,000 penalty was issued not by law, not by process, but by the opinion of one man. An opinion in a suit." Gasps were audible. Some heads turned. Others leaned in. She pivoted back to Baxter. "Are you aware, Mr. Baxter, that legal enforcement requires probable cause, not personal conviction?" He hesitated. "I acted within my authority." Bondi walked closer. "You interpreted an action, but there was no verified violation, no evidentiary standard met, no due process afforded, and yet a fine was issued?" Baxter's confidence began to crack. Bondi stepped back and looked directly at Judge Coleman. "Your Honor, the Constitution does not allow punishment by presumption. Mr. Baxter's complaint wasn't law. It was guesswork." Then she raised her voice, not with volume, but gravity. "If this is allowed to stand, then no American veteran, worker, or public official is safe from the whims of unaccountable authority." She opened her folder and held up a page. "James Carter," she said, her voice steady, "a veteran from Idaho fined and stripped of his business over a clerical error. Took months to reverse, after he lost everything." She flipped another page. "Maria Delgado, electrician. 15 years of spotless work. Shut down overnight due to a licensing change nobody could explain. Told to start over, moved to another state, lost her clients, her home, and her dignity." The gallery was frozen. Baxter sat still, sweating now, and even Judge Roberts didn't dare interrupt. One more page. "William Hayes, retired trucker in Arizona. Fined $12,000 for building a fence that was 43 centimeters over a boundary line. He tore it down himself, then fined again for not removing it fast enough." Bondi looked up. "That's not administration, that's predation." And finally, she rested her hand on the bench in front of her, her eyes burning with quiet fury. "What nearly happened to me today is what's happened to thousands. Power, exercised without oversight, becomes tyranny. We have to decide if this courtroom serves the Constitution or hides behind it." The gallery didn't breathe. Roberts didn't move. Even Coleman leaned forward. Pam Bondi had just done what few could. She'd made the system put itself on trial. For a moment, the courtroom remained absolutely still. The air was thick with tension, as though even the walls had stopped breathing. Pam Bondi, standing centered at the defense table, had just laid waste to the prosecution's foundation. No theatrics, no shouting, just facts, precedent, and relentless clarity. Across the room, Chief Justice John Roberts was no longer the commanding figure he'd been at the start of the hearing. His fingers fidgeted slightly on the wood of the bench. His gaze, once cold and decisive, now seemed clouded by something unfamiliar, uncertainty. He leaned forward at last, forcing his voice to return to the room. "This court retains discretionary authority," he said flatly. "We are not bound to accept every argument simply because it is passionately made. Authority, when necessary, ensures compliance." There was no passion in his voice, no pride. It was the hollow rhetoric of a man cornered, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Pam Bondi didn't flinch. She didn't look rattled. She waited for him to finish, then took a single step forward. Her voice was steady, but her words were sharper than any objection. "Discretionary authority," she said slowly, "is not judicial supremacy. The bench is not a throne. It is a duty." She turned her attention to the gallery, to the rows of attorneys, aides, reporters, and spectators who had watched this hearing shift from mere formality into a full-blown constitutional reckoning. Discretion is not a loophole to bypass due process. It is a tool to be wielded with humility, accountability, and above all, evidence. She looked back to Roberts. This fine was not discretionary. It was dictatorial. No documents, no investigation, no hearing. A $50,000 penalty imposed based on an unverified opinion by a single official. She took a breath, not to steady herself, but to command the room's rhythm. "If you call that discretion, Your Honor, then you've declared the Constitution optional." For a moment, it seemed like Roberts might respond. His jaw moved, his hand twitched toward the gavel. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "I've heard enough." All eyes turned to Judge Samuel Coleman. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room fell silent as Coleman leaned forward, elbows resting on the high federal bench. "Ms. Bondi is correct," he said, each word deliberate, grave. "Discretionary authority does not supersede constitutional protections. It does not allow for enforcement absent evidence." He glanced at the transcript, then at the now visibly shaken investigator, Andrew Baxter. "There is no documentation, no corroborating testimony, and no admissible evidence to justify the fine imposed under Section 204. This court cannot and will not uphold an enforcement action built on subjective interpretation alone." There was no mistaking it now. Coleman was not just disagreeing with Roberts. He was overruling him. Gasps and whispers fluttered through the gallery. The prosecutor sat frozen, hands clenched on his notes, knowing full well that the case had slipped out of their control hours ago. Roberts, for his part, stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on nothing. Coleman continued, "We do not exist to enforce authority. We exist to enforce justice. And justice, as this court has now witnessed, cannot exist without process." The silence that followed was not procedural, it was seismic. For the first time, Chief Justice John Roberts seemed truly diminished, not just legally, but morally. He had attempted to make an example out of Pam Bondi, to assert supremacy over a political opponent by using the power of the court as a weapon, but he had underestimated her, and now, that error stood in the open for all to see. Slowly, Roberts leaned forward. His voice was thin, strained. "This court finds insufficient evidence to sustain the fine under the Federal Communications Act, Section 204. A pause, a swallow, then the words everyone had been waiting for. "The fine is vacated, the charge is dismissed." The gavel did not fall, because the ruling wasn't an act of closure, it was a surrender. Pam Bondi stood still. She didn't raise her arms, she didn't celebrate, she didn't so much as smile. This wasn't triumph, it was vindication. She had not merely won a case, she had forced the most powerful figure in the American judiciary to face his own breach of principle. She had walked into a courtroom where every advantage was stacked against her: public perception, judicial reputation, procedural bias. And she had reduced that entire fortress to rubble, using only truth, precedent, and unwavering resolve. The silence that followed was sacred. Even the soft clicking of laptop keys and whispered scribbles of courtroom sketch artists ceased, replaced by one collective awareness. The system had just been forced to look in the mirror. And the reflection was not pretty. As Judge Coleman gathered his notes, the gallery still didn't move. There was no rustling of coats, no scuffling of shoes. Everyone remained transfixed by the figure at the center of it all, Pam Bondi. She didn't move to leave. Not yet. She simply scanned the room, letting her silence speak for her. Her message was now etched into the memory of that chamber. Unchecked power had been stopped. Not by wealth, not by status, but by the Constitution and the courage of one woman who refused to back down. The federal courthouse emptied slowly, but the silence it left behind wasn't empty. It was electric, charged with the kind of energy that follows a rupture in power. Pam Bondi's courtroom triumph hadn't just cleared her name or reversed a $50,000 fine. It had shattered the illusion that the judicial system, particularly its administrative arm, was immune to scrutiny. What began as a quiet procedural hearing had, by its end, become the epicenter of a constitutional earthquake. News traveled quickly. By nightfall, headlines blazed across television screens and news apps. Pam Bondi defeats Chief Justice in stunning courtroom upset. Federal fine vacated after no evidence found, and judge overruled as Bondi asserts constitutional rights. Cable news anchors scrambled to get legal analysts on air. The footage of Bondi standing calmly, her hand resting on a stack of legal precedents as she confronted Chief Justice John Roberts, played on loop. Clips of her cross-examining FCC investigator Andrew Baxter, methodically exposing his lack of evidence, went viral across platforms. On social media, the hashtags Bondi vs. Roberts and Due Process Matters began trending within hours. But the courtroom victory was only the beginning. Within days, investigative journalists and watchdog organizations began looking deeper into FCC enforcement records, starting with Bondi's case and quickly discovering it was not an outlier. They uncovered a disturbing trend: large, administrative fines issued without any accompanying documentation. No photographs, no incident reports, not even emails confirming violations. Entire fines had been issued, appealed, and paid based on nothing more than an agent's word and a signed form. In some cities, internal whistleblowers came forward, confirming that investigators had been quietly incentivized to meet quotas under the guise of compliance. A culture of unchecked power, one Bondi had exposed with surgical precision, was now unraveling. From Des Moines to Sacramento, citizens who had been fined, penalized, or silenced began to speak out. Small business owners posted photos of violations they had never been shown, legal letters they never understood, and outcomes they were told couldn't be appealed. Town hall meetings filled with frustrated residents began drawing regional press. Pam Bondi's victory became more than a legal headline, it became a rallying cry. City officials scrambled to respond. In several jurisdictions, mayors and municipal attorneys ordered audits of enforcement departments. Legal teams were tasked with reviewing years' worth of citations. Bondi's courtroom transcript was cited in more than one internal memo as the standard for procedural failure. In some cities, hundreds of fines were vacated. In others, lawsuits were quietly settled before the public caught wind. Public trust had been broken, and Bondi's name was on everyone's lips, not as a politician, not even just as a lawyer, but as a symbol of unflinching resolve in the face of bureaucratic injustice. The legal world took notice too. Law schools began using the case as a new cornerstone of their administrative law curriculum. At conferences, panels debated whether Roberts had knowingly circumvented due process or simply misjudged Bondi's preparedness. Federal judges began receiving updated training memos on discretionary authority and its constitutional limits. Some agencies preemptively updated their enforcement policies, fearing further exposure. Others tried to discredit the movement, but the narrative was already out of their control. In Washington, congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle acknowledged the significance of what had occurred. Hearings were scheduled. One bipartisan bill proposed a national enforcement standard for administrative fines, mandatory documentation, independent review, and public access to evidence. The speech that accompanied the bill's introduction directly referenced Bondi's case as the legal fulcrum that revealed just how far the pendulum had swung toward unchecked authority. Through it all, Pam Bondi remained composed and mostly quiet. She did not grant flashy interviews, she gave no rallies. But everywhere her name was spoken, it was spoken with reverence. The image of her standing firm in front of Roberts, citing Supreme Court precedent like a weapon, became iconic. Her courtroom performance was analyzed by law students and downloaded as a template by defense attorneys around the country. She had reminded the country of something essential. Justice is not just about rules, it's about truth. It's not just about hierarchy, it's about accountability. Her resolve had not only protected herself, but empowered countless others to demand fairness from a system that too often relied on their silence. Pam Bondi had not sought a revolution, but in her quiet refusal to yield, she had sparked one. Weeks passed, but the shockwaves of Pam Bondi's courtroom stand showed no sign of slowing. What happened inside that federal courthouse was no longer viewed as an isolated legal drama. It had become something far greater. A line in the sand between unchecked authority and constitutional accountability. Her name was now spoken not just in law circles, but in city halls, college classrooms, and households where people had grown tired of government overreach. Major news outlets continued to cover the story with fresh angles. 60 Minutes aired a feature titled "Power on Trial," chronicling how Bondi's defense had peeled back the veil on years of enforcement practices that prioritized speed over scrutiny. Investigative journalists uncovered story after story. Small business owners fined for invisible infractions, retirees penalized for errors they never had the chance to challenge, and federal agents whose word was treated as gospel without requiring a single piece of corroborating evidence. In response, a movement emerged, not chaotic, not political, but principled and focused, built on transparency, accountability, and evidence. Community organizers formed alliances to audit administrative fines in their regions. Pro bono legal clinics began helping citizens challenge arbitrary penalties. Cities in California, Texas, Florida, and Illinois rolled back enforcement programs quietly, fearing exposure. In some places, lawsuits followed. In others, resignations. Pam Bondi never asked for this role. She wasn't seeking glory or vengeance. She had stood her ground, not out of ambition, but conviction. When the system told her to sit down, she stood taller. When the judge told her there was no room for argument, she answered with precedent. When silence was expected, she brought clarity. And that clarity created change. Bondi's case became standard reading in constitutional law courses across the country. It was cited in 3 state-level court decisions as a precedent to reject fines issued without due process. Judges and regulators alike began treading more carefully, knowing that every ruling could now be questioned, every decision scrutinized for evidence, fairness, and legality. In the public imagination, Bondi had come to represent more than a legal victory. She embodied the truth that the Constitution is not a document of convenience. It is a covenant, and that covenant is only preserved when someone is willing to stand alone and speak truth to power. Her legacy wasn't forged by outrage, it was etched by resolve. She didn't scream or storm out. She stood, she spoke, and she never stepped back. And then, like all great stories of justice, she walked out into the daylight not looking for applause, but leaving behind a courtroom changed forever. If Pam Bondi's story moved you, if it made you think, challenged your assumptions, or reminded you of the power one person can have against an unaccountable system, do one thing right now. Share this video. Because somewhere out there, someone else is facing a silent injustice. And maybe, just maybe, your voice could help them stand like she did. Subscribe to the channel, tap the bell icon so you never miss our next story, and remember the law isn't just a shield for the powerful. It's a promise for the people. Thank you for watching, and see you in the video.